Mr. David Bahnsen, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Can you briefly explain the concept of dividends for those who may not have heard of it before?
Well, I assume that you're asking the question in the context of financial dividends, that is, monies paid from publicly traded companies and the system of investing that I have largely built my business around. Is that a pretty fair assumption of the context of your question?
Yes, it is.
Because we know dividends as a more generic idea when we say, something pays dividends. Like
Right.
I read this book, it taught me a lot, and then I got a dividend from it. Like it generated some benefit to me,
Some return.
some return. All we're doing is giving a more specific and literal illustration of the same concept. At a high level, a dividend is a benefit we receive from something we've done. And in the case of a financial dividend, it is a benefit we receive from a risk we took. As an equity investor, the risk one takes is that the company will not be successful, will not generate profits, etc. When you do invest in a company, you do not have security, right? When you loan a company money, you're in some line to get paid back. Now, the IRS may be in front of you, the employees who get payroll may be in front of you, but you're a creditor. You have a lien on the assets of the business, assuming there are assets.
Right.
So that's a benefit of security that a lender has. But an investor who is an owner of a business doesn't have that security. So they've taken risk, and there are a lot of things can go wrong in investing in a business. A dividend is simply a way in which you monetize the risk you took. I invest in Jackson's lemonade stand. It does well. Now he has profits. How do I get paid for the risk I took? What's my return? A
Right.
dividend is a way of getting a return on the investment.
And it's different from a traditional growth structure where if you invest in Jackson's Lemonade Stand and then the stock of Jackson's Lemonade Stand goes up, your investment capital that you put in raises as well as the percentage rises. Or sorry, the amount of money in that percentage rises, correct?
It is not different. It is both and. It is not either or.
Got it.
Okay, when one buys stock in McDonald's and the value of McDonald's goes up, they still own the same stock they owned before. When I invest in your lemonade stand, I own 50% of the lemonade stand, and it's either worth more or it's not. But the dividend is simply money I'm receiving along the way. So the issue is not really to get equity that rises in value or not. It's to get equity that rises in value with a dividend, or get equity that either rises or doesn't rise in value without a dividend. In other words, equity is not rising in value unless a company is successful,
Hmm.
unless it's making money.
Right.
All a dividend is an answer to the question, what do we do with the money that the company made?
Got it.
And a dividend is one solution for what to do with after-tax profits.
Got it. Okay, so it's a bit like a surplus, and you give to the people who invested in your company originally. Is that correct?
Correct. And so when a company makes money, they now have a certain amount of money they didn't have before. That's the definition of a profit. It's a
Right.
gain.
Hmm.
So with that money, and now taxes are paid, Uncle Sam's always paid first, okay? Then after that, what do we do with after-tax profits? And they're not mutually exclusive. It isn't like you're picking one of these four things. It could be all four blended together in varying proportions.
Hmm.
But you could hold the money to reinvest in the business. You could buy back the stock. In other words, with the monies, you could say, David, you invested in my lemonade stand. We've now gotten ahead. You didn't really seem to want to make the investment to begin with. It's done well. I'm going to use some of these profits to buy you out. Is this price good? Now you go from 50% to 100% because you took me out, but then with the profits, I got paid back. So it's a little tricky with our lemonade stand analogy, but with like Apple or Google, stock buybacks or something you could do with the profits. So you could reinvest the money, buy back more of the company. You could pay out a dividend, or you could pay off debt if the company has debt. A fifth use of profits would be what we call M&A, mergers and acquisitions. You could
Mm.
say, hey, David, I'm not going to pay you a dividend. I'm not going to buy you out. We don't have any debt to pay off. And I don't want the money sitting in the bank. I don't need any new equipment. But Bill's lemonade stand down the corner is competing with us. Let's use some of our profits to go buy that turkey out. And then we're going to have a bigger market share. So those are pretty much the only 5 things one could do with profits. And what we're advocating is that dividends ought to be a significant one of the 5 in mature companies in the way we choose to invest.
Yeah, this does feel like a maturity not only of companies but also of an economic market at large. At the, I- that you at the beginning of a market, when you're starting things, founding them out, you kind of need to take more risks and not have as much assurance. But this feels like an assurance and a more mature way of investing in the belief that this is going to, you have more belief that this is going to yield a result. Is that correct?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both a result of the company being more mature and an indication of it being more mature. In other words, if the company's brand new and you just put up your lemonade stand a week ago, you just probably don't have the profits. You don't have the recurring profits. You don't
Right.
have the sustainable business model. You don't know what next weekend is going to bring. So the only reason you're in a position to pay a dividend is because you're more mature, but then also because you're more mature, it's the right thing to do. Right? In other words, what are you going to do as a return on invested capital if you don't? You're going to either let the money sit there and get no return and be unproductive capital, or you're going to blow it. And that's what a lot of companies do that don't pay out dividends to their shareholders. They hold on to money. They already are mature enough that they have a significant amount of productivity in their profits, meaning they don't need to turn the profits around into more equipment to generate more. Okay,
Right.
there's a self-funding mechanism in the nature of the business. So when you think about multi-billion dollar public companies that have paid dividends for 50 years, they're not in a position where they need a lot of their profits to fund their expansion, right?
Right.
So then they could use the money for vanity M&A. I use this analogy all the time, and it's hard because a company like Apple generates $100 billion a year. People could say, who cares about setting $3 billion on fire? But last time I checked, even if 3% is a low percentage, 3 billion is still a heck of a lot of money. And when they bought Dr. Dre's stupid headphone company, it was the type of deal a company does that money is burning hole in their pocket.
Yep.
And dividends alleviate some of that risk. You're rewarding shareholders and not letting money burn a hole in your pocket.
Yeah. This seems like it's good for shareholders who are getting dividends, but how is it beneficial for the companies themselves?
Well, who is a company owned by?
Let's take Apple, and it's a majority of shareholders, correct?
It's 100% owned by shareholders. So what is a scenario where something could be good for the owners of a business and not good for the business?
True. But you're not taking that excess capital and, um, like Apple could
Apple
potentially
generates
expand.
$100 billion of new free cash flow per year, and
Right.
already has 200 to 250 billion accumulated.
Right.
So the amount of retained earnings sitting on the balance sheet is like enough to buy a few countries. Still
Yeah.
generating more money. Now they can't pay 100% out in dividends because they want to be fiscal stewards of the fact that they're in a high capital intensity business. There's new R&D, new inventions, some of which end up being stupid. They spent, I think, 7 billion trying to get into electric vehicles, and they go, well, this is dumb. We're not going to do this. And they got out of it. They
Yeah.
just set that money on fire. But no one's going to care because they've made so much money with the core part of their business. They're allowed to throw a little money in the trash can on electric vehicles and on Dr. Dre's headphone company. But for most businesses, that's an incredibly undisciplined thing to do with $10 billion.
Hmm.
So what Apple is doing is making their business a better business by returning dividends to the shareholders because it is a return on invested capital. When you are not providing that return, you are essentially either letting the money sit there, and what does money earn when it's sitting in the bank? 2, 3,
Right.
4%. Or you are doing bad deals with the money, but when you return it to shareholders, you're all at once rewarding them for the risks they took and making your business a more high return business, because it's a business that can return capital to shareholders. Who wants to be invested in a company that can't return capital to shareholders?
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. So it looks attractive to the market outside. Look, he can hand out several $billion in dividends to our shareholders. So why not invest with us as opposed to someone else?
It's still important to remember the chicken or egg here, though. They fundamentally are not valuable because they return capital to shareholders. They're
Right.
valuable
Yes.
because they make the profits that are used to return capital to shareholders.
Yes.
So all we're ever talking about, we're presupposing philosophically, there's a presupposition here that we're talking about companies that make these profits. If they don't, the whole conversation changes. But
Hmm.
once we are dealing with companies that make the profits, then all we're discussing is what is the best use of the profits.
Right.
And I've suggested there's 5 possibilities, and dividends are the one that most rewards and honors shareholders, that
Yeah.
most respects the fiduciary duty to return capital to those who took a risk in investing in the business, especially, by the way, minority shareholders. See, if I owned 70% of Apple, I may say, I don't necessarily need a dividend because I have this master strategy I'm in charge of, and I can really drive this company to better places. And unlike those turkeys who were buying Dre's headphone company and setting money on fire electric vehicle, I control this in such a way it's going to be brilliant. But minority shareholders that own a tiny fraction of businesses, they have no such control. So dividends become a way for them to really be monetized and respected.
Yeah. So you build more of a loyal fan base. The question is then, why don't all companies do this?
Well, there's a number of reasons. There's good reasons and bad reasons for some companies not to pay dividends. And there's also a sort of timeline to this. So some of it is not that they don't pay dividends, it's that they don't pay dividends yet, that they are trying to mature more as a business or whatnot. So I
Hmm.
look at some of the companies we own, Cisco, IBM, Texas Instruments. These were all old school technology companies that back in the day did not pay dividends.
Hmm.
Now they're all mature, older, more seasoned businesses with huge balance sheets, very sustainable business models, and recurring cash flows that enable them to pay dividends.
Right.
And so sometimes it's not why don't they pay dividends, it's when will they pay dividends. Okay, Microsoft did not pay dividends for years and years. And then all of a sudden, they changed the tax rate on dividends, and Bill Gates retired, and lo and behold, they started paying dividends. So there's some companies that it's not that they don't pay them, it's that they don't pay them yet. Others, they're highly cyclical businesses. They could make $1 billion one year and lose $1 billion another year. And that might be okay. And as long as your shareholders know your dividend's not going to be sustainable or recurring, some years we'll have it, some years we won't. But then if the business is also, in addition to being cyclical, going from big gains to big losses, if it's also capital intensive, you may not want to be in a position to pay out a dividend. So a company like Tesla could lose a lot of money one year, they can make a fair amount another, but there's a constant need to reinvest capital into the business because it's a high capital intensity manufacturing, R&D, expensive technology type of company. And so they become a very bad candidate to pay out a recurring dividend.
Right.
And then there are just companies that don't do it because they are run by non-owners. This is a systemic problem in corporate America. So many of our CEOs are hired managers that have very little of their own personal wealth invested in the business.
Hmm.
The companies that are the great dividend growers have original founders or kids of founders or grandkids of founders that own a ton of the stock, and they have skin in the game. They're receiving a lot of dividends as part of their generational investment. Of course, other shareholders receiving the fruits of that tree. But so many CEOs, they are hired hands. They may have received stock as part of their executive compensation, but they didn't put a lot of risk from their own balance sheet in the business.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, I don't think those interests are always aligned. Where what is better for a CEO to announce, hey, I paid out a big dividend to the family that owns a lot of stock that hired me, or I went out and merged with this other company. I did a hot, sexy acquisition of one of our competitors that got me on CNBC and got me in the Wall Street Journal. M&A, it can be a very good thing, but it can be a very vain thing. And that's a big part of the reason why companies don't do dividends is because it can be anti-vanity.
Hmm. Yeah. No, it does seem like a almost a biblical idea, that you would want to not keep 100% of the profit, that you're doing this to bless other people as well. It doesn't seem very Wall Street in that sense.
Well, I guess that depends what you mean by Wall Street. Is
Yeah.
Wall Street a euphemism for our financial markets, our capital markets?
Yes, and I think partly the persona that's been built by things like The Big Short, or even movies like The Wolf of Wall Street, where it's just greed and how much can I get for myself.
Yes, I would say that those two movies are pretty unhelpful in describing what Wall Street's really like, in the sense that very few people who understand our nation's capital markets, everybody is benefiting by being under the sophistication and resources and wisdom and learned experiences of our nation's financial markets. We all,
Hmm.
day to day, both as consumers and producers, are blessed
Right.
by financial markets. But in sort of Hollywood sensationalistic desire to create class envy, there's a characterization that what you're describing with Wolf of Wall Street is more a hedonism. I mean,
Hmm.
nobody would think those were the A team of sophisticates. They're a bunch of used car salesmen, degenerates, and drug addicts that were now, partying hard. Okay.
Right.
That's pretty easy to sort of dismiss. You may have noticed that life doesn't usually work out for very long.
No.
But with the characterization in Big Short that there were very smart people that were taking short-term gains, even then, I would argue that in any entrepreneurial endeavor, there are people that sometimes let short-term decisions get in the way of long-term wisdom. If there's one thing that patient capital has, is patience. Okay, and capital always and forever migrates with a sort of gravitational pull to where it can get its highest return.
Hmm.
And the fact of the matter is that you look at a company like McDonald's that has paid and grown a dividend every year since 1967. Walmart, that went public in 1973, has grown its dividend every single year. I'd say Wall Street has pretty richly rewarded those companies. 67,000% return, 71,000% return. There is an incredible appreciation on Wall Street for diligent, patient capital.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that over romanticizing, or maybe the misconception that's been built by Hollywood, has also kind of prodded the anger, hatred, resentment towards Wall Street, towards the people who are in New York, who are in DC, that a lot of middle class Midwestern people have.
Yeah.
That this kind of idea that Wall Street is out against you, and that's kind of why people like Trump, who are saying, "Hey, there's something wrong with the system. Let me tear it up." Are gain such popularity.
Yeah, it's fascinating too, because you'd be very hard pressed to find someone who cares more about what Wall Street thinks about him than Donald Trump. And yet, you're right, there's this idea that the interest of Wall Street are against the interest of Main Street. But that idea comes from an ideology, and that ideology is class warfare. It's covetousness, but fundamentally, there's bad people on Wall Street, there's good people on Wall Street, bad people on Main Street, good people on Main Street. But if one understands what Wall Street is, which is essentially just a figure of speech for our financial markets, there can be no financial markets apart from underlying a good or service.
Hmm.
Goods or services are made by people all over the country, and production and consumption are part of the virtuous cycle of being in a country, having an economy. And there's capital needed behind that. And that's all Wall Street is. So when someone says, oh, well, there's a lot of drugs and fornication on Wall Street, and there's a lot of drugs and fornication, awful lot of businesses, none more so in Wall Street than anything else. It just, unfortunately, sin is equally distributed across society.
Yeah, and Wall Street just happens to have more money, and so they have more access to things like that.
Yeah, that may
It's
be true, but also there's a lot more motive for the media to portray a sort of cartoonish view of Wall Street because the people want to believe it. I mean, the people definitely want to hate Wall Street. I think
yeah.
that stems from class envy.
Yeah, no, envy, I think, plays a big part in society at large today. We see this especially with social media. We're going to talk more later about Gen Z's lack of work ethic, which Dave Portnoy got upset about. But I do think envy plays a big part in where we are now. As far as Trump's economic policy, things like the tariffs, things like his lack of tariffs with everyone but China. How is that affecting Wall Street? Is it affecting people with dividends differently?
No, the main people it's affecting are small businesses. It's doing, most of the big public companies either got exceptions to the tariffs, they got waivers, they have lobbyists, they have lawyers, so they kind of work around it. And even if they're not in one of the privileged businesses that got an exception to tariffs, by nature of being a large public company, at worst case, they at least have access to capital markets. So they have the financial wherewithal via access to equity capital or debt capital to get
Right.
through it. So I think that the people victimized most by it are small businesses that go at 30, 60, 90 days at a time, all of a sudden have a huge input increase in their cost structure and they're not able to weather the storm. Or even worse sometimes than an actual input increase is uncertainty, where they don't know what to do, so they end up doing nothing. And that's very hard for a business to function.
Yeah, we saw that a lot with the when Biden was president. We did lots of Red Balloon did lots of surveys, and most of the time the people were just like, "I'm holding, I'm waiting," and
Yeah.
that's kind of what turned the economy downward. How much of this is what Trump's doing is kind of necessary chemo for a sick economy?
Well, I don't know what he's doing exactly to be able to answer that. So if we say threatening to do tariffs and then not doing them, is that chemo to a sick economy? I don't think so. If he actually went through with certain tariffs, is that chemo? I don't think so. A tariff is just a tax. And in this particular case, it's a tax that is being selectively applied to certain businesses. If the point of this is chemo to get more things onshored, we want to do more domestic manufacturing, that appears to no longer be the goal. As a matter of fact, as we're sitting here recording, it's 24 hours after the president said, I don't want us making shoes and t-shirts here in America, where a month ago he said he did want that. He wants high-end manufacturing jobs, which is America's more suited to do. So I can't really answer what he's trying to do economically because I don't think there's a lot of clarity on what the objectives are. If the objectives are that we want low-wage jobs coming to America, I would disagree that that's a great objective or a chemo to fix things. If we want to increase prices of what consumers pay, people aren't really going to have a lot of patience for that. But if the goal is just to get better trade deals or open up new markets with other countries or things like that, and that's kind of where I think this is headed, is just the announcement of, oh, we got to deal with India for this, so we got to deal with South Korea for that. Then people probably end up being happy with that end resolution, and I'll let others debate if that could have been done in a little bit, shall we say, less chaotic way.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on trying to bring all of the manufacturing back to America?
Well, I'm vehemently against the government being in charge of what happens within the economy. I'm a limited government, free market conservative who does not believe that we need one individual in Washington, D.C. to dictate where people should be making goods and what goods people should be buying. I believe in consumer choice. I believe in a free and open market. And there's right now the ability to say, I only want to buy products made in America. And if somebody wants to do that, they can do that. I also believe in the law of comparative advantage. There are certain things that can be done cheaper elsewhere. By the way, there's certain things that can only be done elsewhere. We're
Hmm.
only going to be able to get our coffee imported from South America and whatnot. I mean, it would be very
Right.
difficult for Hawaii to produce all of the necessary coffee. So from commodities alone, agriculture alone, there's always been benefits to the various respected comparative advantages of other countries. What
Right.
America does very well right now is produce services, and we export a lot of them to the rest of the world. So there is no scenario by which we can try to benefit our domestic manufacturers using protective tariffs or the interventions of the state that is not going to hurt another part of the economy. And I'm very against the government picking winners and losers. I take the conservative view that we had when President Obama was, wanting to subsidize companies like Solyndra. I think it's a very bad idea for the government to be in the business of picking winners and losers.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that in 2008. That's kind of one of the big things that happened was the government bailed out. They said, these people are too big to fail. They must win," and that has produced a lot of mayhem and carnage. I do wonder, given the unsurety on the war front around the world, how much I think it would be helpful to bring a lot of the manufacturing, especially of technology, to America.
Now, if the issue is national security and critical infrastructure, how would that get better with tariffs? Like, if it's a threat to national security, so I would be in favor of there being no dependence on adversarial countries at all for
Right.
anything necessary to our national security.
Yes.
But I would not change my mind if they were paying us. Like,
Right. Oh yeah, yeah.
if we
Agreed.
tax them, then it's okay if they hold us in the palm of their hand. So
Right.
if we're being honest that we're concerned about national security, then a tariff is a non sequitur because it doesn't become safer for our country just because we're getting paid some tax revenue. So my view would be anything that is a matter of critical national security, we should be fully reliant either on our own domestic capacity or at least ally nations.
Yeah.
But with adversarial nations, it seems rather clear to me that that's being thrown out as a red herring because nobody who's concerned about national security would be less concerned about it with a 20% tariff.
Oh yeah. Very much agreed. I think I wonder if what Trump is doing is trying to incentivize bringing a lot of those manufacturing jobs, bringing the national security manufacturing back to America
Well,
by use
what
of
is an
tariffs.
example of some national security manufacturing that is not done in America?
Um, I think if I remember correctly that China actually produces a good bit of the microchips that we use in some of our military
Yeah, more
headsets.
specifically Taiwan, and it comes through China, and there's metals and minings that are involved in that process. So for years and years, we have done everything we can to push those countries to Taiwan for about 30 years, and with high taxes, high regulation. So now we started a process years ago to bring a lot of that back. Massive tens of billions of dollars of investment in Ohio and in Arizona and in Texas. Then the Biden administration passed something called the CHIPS Act, where we were going to pay these companies money to do some of their manufacturing onshore. But then they had to have like adult daycare. They had to have racial quotas,
Hmm.
LGBT quotas, some of these things. So we got the state all involved in this, and it didn't go very well. And then now President Trump has said, I don't like the subsidy idea, but let's go with the tariff idea. It's a very simple thing to solve. If is deemed a matter of national security and critical infrastructure, then all we have to do is be a hospitable country to our own domestic companies that make the products, not overregulate, overtax them into going offshore. But
Right.
then when we do want them to come back, the last thing we need to be doing is paying them a subsidy in corporate welfare to come back onshore.
Yeah.
All the tariff is the flip side of the exact same coin.
Right.
So I think other people will not use an example of microchips or semiconductors, where obviously we have massive capacity for doing this onshore now. Texas Instruments, NVIDIA, Taiwan Semiconductor out in Arizona is building up half of the state to go about doing this onshore. There's no reason for any of that to have to happen in China. But then when people talk about our missiles, our tanks, and other matters of military, industrial infrastructure, all of that could be done onshore immediately, and no tariff is going to solve for any of that.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. I do wonder with the tariffs thing because it is a stick, not the carrot. But the subsidies is kind of maybe an incentive to break status quo. Because if you have all your stuff in Taiwan and China, and your chip manufacturing there, it's more expensive to come over the ocean and start producing it here. So the subsidies act as a,
An incentive.
an incentive against
Right. Well,
status
that is
quo.
true, though, of every business all the time,
Right.
that anybody who gets paid to do something of somebody else's money is more likely to do it. This
Hmm.
is a profit making activity. So I believe that there is no limiting principle to when we say that the government should pay someone to do what they do anyways. It is called
Right.
corporate welfare.
Yeah. Agreed. And I would love the government to get out of most things. But for national security, is
But
it
nobody
worth?
believes that what we're talking about with CHIPS Act was about national security. It just simply isn't true. Intel was not making the chips necessary for us. We are giving companies that already make $10 billion a year, we're giving them taxpayer money to do what they were already doing anyways. And that's
Got
the
it.
problem with the government subsidy, is
Yeah.
it distorts behavior. Again, it's not about carrot or stick. It's a very, very simple policy. When it comes to the matters of critical infrastructure, if it's the government as the buyer, we own the purchase order. We can say we will not buy if you are reliant on adversarial nations in your global supply chain.
This is true.
As a customer, we have the ability to affect a market outcome.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a good point. But the problem is we don't. A lot of the time, we take what's cheaper, even if it's less secure. And I wonder if Trump's trying to just eliminate all the competition.
Trying to eliminate the competition. Well,
Right.
I mean, obviously he's not. What he's brokering right now is a deal to get them to buy more things from us in exchange for us buying things from them. What I will say to you is that this is easily remedied by compartmentalizing the conversation. By when you stew, when you stir together in your stew national security and protectionism together, you basically get neither. You don't get a result that is protectionist or industrial policy to
Right.
produce the sort of fox protection of American manufacturers, and you don't get a better outcome from national security. But if we were to separate the conversation with clear policy lines, not couched around industrial policy or economic protectionism, but around specific national security, we've already done that when it comes to much of our military ordering, and companies like Lockheed Martin or General Dynamics. We have very strict protocols as to how we go about ordering and sourcing some of that work. So I think that the ambiguity in the policy has served to, unfortunately, undermine the president's own policy objectives. But that's the one policy objective in this that I'm vehemently for, is a complete and total non-reliance on adversarial actors for matters of critical infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we agree on that. What would your what would if you could change something here? Um, would you remove the tariffs? What goal do you think what do you think he's trying to do with those?
Well, look, I don't want to be critical of President in the sense that there's so many things I'm very appreciative of what he's doing, but my
Agreed. Yeah.
answer to this is not very complimentary. I mean, I know exactly what he's doing. I don't. I believe he wants the headline announcement that he got deals done, and the details are totally irrelevant to him. So announcing that we got he's a deal maker. He's a transaction guy.
Right.
And unfortunately, he got very bad advice as to what the level of chaos would be if he tried this based on trade deficits. Once he found out that it was bad advice, he undid it right away. And so he's now gone back on a lot of these things. And here we are. So, I think that he would like to announce that deals were done, and I think in the end, some deals will get done. Some
Yeah.
of them will be helpful, and some of them will be kind of.
Yeah, I do think he wants to kind of reassert the American authority on the global on a global economic scale, and so that probably is uh, getting in the way, affecting a lot of the choices he's making. Is kind of making America look great again, even if it comes at a cost later on.
I think it also, though, is damaging to the cause. If you want to make America look great again, and you say that one of your objectives is you're going to move all of those manufacturing jobs back to Ohio, and then that doesn't happen because it is most certainly not going to happen,
Right.
then I think you've really undermined a lot of credibility with working class Americans who I just believe in blessing people by telling them the truth. And I don't think that they're getting the truth. Those
Hmm.
jobs are not coming back. And if they did, they would be filled by robots.
Yep. Yeah. Um, this kind of leads into the lack of belief that we can fix this thing. I think is well, Dave Portnoy was complaining about the my generation, Gen Z, doesn't really work as hard. They don't want to grind in Omaha. Um, I think part of it is they actually don't believe they can make it, that they can really have a difference and be successful with things like the housing market and the average median income running away from each other for the past several decades. I think there's a lot of like hopelessness.
Well, I agree. There's a lot of hopelessness. I myself, as a Christian, generally do not default to government policy as the source of hopelessness, but generally believe there's more of a spiritual malady at play.
This is true, and
And,
government
and
can
that's
kind
what
of
I
be
think
the
is going on here is that I think that we have a hopelessness that is largely caused by godlessness and will therefore be cured by God fullness, not godlessness. And along the way, I want to get the public policy right as much as we can. I'd like to have the right tax policy, the right trade policy, the right regulatory policy. But if we tell ourselves that our problems come from a trade deal with China from 30 years ago, or a trade deal with Mexico from 40 years ago, or something else that's in the public policy realm, I think that the hard part about that is it can be used as an excuse to not deal with the underlying root of the problem.
right abdicating responsibility.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. How much of the rampant individualism, how much do you think that's playing an effect in this as well?
Well, I think that rampant individualism is the inverse of rampant collectivism and statism, and that they are two different extremes that are not that separate from one another. What they both have in common is a separation from what is ultimately necessary for civil society, which is being rooted to God and his transcendent truths. And so, what we have seen is people say rampant individualism has created a lot of problems. And then we go to the other, we fall off one side of the horse, and fall off. We get up on one side of the horse and fall off on the other.
Right.
And I think that both a statist collectivism that has a huge role for Washington, D.C., to a kind of a messianic view of the government to fix our lives is an extreme problem. And I believe a rugged, hollow, godless individualism is another problem. And that the right solution for civil society is found in strong families, communities, churches, and what we call civil society. And there are mediating institutions that are necessary between the extreme of statism and the extreme of individualism. And those institutions are where we can have a pretty good fabric for social cooperation. And unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of people on the right and the left on the left and the right that are tearing down that mediating institution framework, which I think is necessary for social cohesion and for the common good.
Yeah. No, the desecration of the family has been a goal that the left has been, and non-Christians have been pursuing for a long time. Rampant pagans. I do think we're in a moment. I wonder if we're I think we're in a moment where people are realizing that the state is not God, that this ditch we're in here over on the left is a bad idea. As they're kind of waking up, how do we catch them before they jump into the individualist side of the ditch, which is government is a terrible idea. We shouldn't have any government. It should just be anarchy.
Yeah, I guess I'm not totally sure that observing the same thing. I would love to believe that because I think it's much easier to remedy the predicament you're talking about. But I think that unfortunately, what I'm seeing is not so much big government versus not big government as much as let's have big government as a solution to our problems, but it'll be our big government, not their big government. And so, a sort of Elizabeth Warren republicanism, a big government conservatism, I view as a contradiction in terms. But I think that seems to be the most popular movement right now out of a right wing populism is the notion that we can have a messianic view of politics, a messianic view of government to fix our problems. It's just going to be different because our big government solution at least gets the pronouns correct or other cultural things, you know. I think all that's pretty important. I don't really have a lot of trust for people that can't get pronouns correct. But yeah, fundamentally, when it comes to economic liberty, I do not believe a big government solution is going to work well, whether it comes from the right or the left. And so the need of the hour to avoid rugged individualism, or rampant and atheistic individualism, but also to avoid a right or left wing populism, I think again has to come from this more American ideal that I think values liberty and virtue. And again, the pivotal importance of institutions like family and church that makes for strong communities. So there's this sort of localism that's very necessary. And I would envision a bigger place for local and state activity and a much lower vision for Washington, D.C.
I would agree. I think people like Elon Musk have a similar or the same vision. That's why things like Doge have been so hard at work to kind of remove, to limit, to slow down government. I think a lot of people like the Javier Milei Argentina style of government, um, branches of government being cut off and diminished. Uh, why do you think that people are still looking at the government as God, as their savior?
Oh, I think that's been throughout the testimony of history, more or less since First Samuel. What people do, they replace. If you don't have the one living and true God, you replace it with a counterfeit God.
Yeah, but at this moment we're less on the I am the true God, right? Less on the self and more on the government is the true God. Although there's actually a bit of both.
Yeah, that's right. There is a tension in the right now, in the secular right, between one or the other, and so it's why I believe the only sustainable conservatism is one that is rooted ultimately to a biblical worldview. But you know, there's a very kind of intellectually schizophrenic messaging right now. That on one hand we say we want less of government, but then in other areas we want a lot more. You know, Doge says it wants to eliminate fraud, waste, and corruption, but then there is a massive increase of what we're looking government to do in other areas. So, you know, it's going to be very difficult to, in one election cycle, get any of this stuff fixed because I don't think that there has been a permeation of the right worldview around this. I'd like to see more of a restoration of the founders' intentions and more of a Burkean sensibility for American life and it's certainly American government.
Yeah, and I think Gen Z will probably be the ones that are called on to lead that charge as we're starting out in the workforce. Um,
Yeah.
what would your encouragement be for them, given that there's a lot of Gen Z who just kind of feels like they don't want to give their lives to work like a lot of the older generations did, where the baby boomers they didn't have um, parents. A lot of them didn't have parents that really cared for them. They were just at work, but there's a large section of them that just don't want to work at all. They just want to retire early. What would your encouragement be to them?
Well, I think this part is reasonably simple, even if it isn't easy. I would recommend not ignoring your family and not having a low view of work.
And what does that look like practically?
Well, I think that it comes from a applied wisdom in the full counsel of God that reminds us that he made us to work, he made us to produce, he made us to create and ideate and innovate, and that there is incredible purpose and dignity that comes from that. And at the same time, we are not made merely, you talk about the individualism. There's a tension in Christian theology around the one and the many. We are all at once individuals made in the image of God, and our dignity does not come from belonging to a family, and it certainly does not come from belonging to a state. And yet, even though we are individually made in the image of God, we are also parts of a community. We are social beings that interact both in families and in neighborhoods and whatnot. And I think that in our work, we have a chance to bless others and live out our God-given individual mandate towards work and do so in a community context, do so in a social context. We're making goods and services that meet the needs of others. So I think Gen Z being able to adopt that message and understand it as part and parcel of the vision of a Christian life that involves us being husbands, wives, sons, daughters, members of a community, members of a church, that these are not at odds with one another, that they're part of the entirety of a good life. And this is something that is very difficult to do if somebody is not seeking that kind of wisdom. If one says, I need to figure this out on my own, they're very likely to go all in on one counterfeit God versus another. And this vision I have for a very robust view of work that is not in remote tension at all with our families, that is to me something that comes from biblical wisdom.
Yeah. How would you see that affecting that biblical view of work, affecting the area that you're in, Wall Street?
Well, I think that in any area, it's not unique to working in finance. I
This
think
is
that
true.
there
Yep.
that there is a really big need for people to existentially contemplate what they're doing. What is it that one is doing if they're raising capital for an enterprise? What is it one is doing if they are investing capital for somebody else? These different enterprises somebody may be in. What is it fundamentally that we're doing? And so to sort of get back to the basics of what entrepreneurial activity is, what we are seeking to do in a particular business endeavor, and then attaching that to our own vocational purpose and calling. I don't think there's enough contemplation that goes on about this. And so you get a lot of people today in Gen Z in the secular left that say, I'll work hard. I don't want to be lazy, but I need to know that the work is going to have some purpose to it, that there's a mission. And so I'll go do that silly work of marketing or manufacturing or production, but then I need to know that the profits are going to go to some cause of social justice. So in other words, they want to kind of sacralize or baptize the work with something meaningful after the fact, but are not seeing the intrinsic value of the work itself, that in whatever the objective of that company is, in marketing, manufacturing, what production, that they are indeed blessing other people with the actual goods and services being made. And it's a little bit more excusable in my mind, from the secular left, but I find it totally inexcusable for Christians to not think through what it is they're doing in their work and why there is that inherent calling in it, and of course, blessing bestowed upon others if their work is done well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. There's I think a statistic that I saw recently that more, I forget the percentage, a lot of Gen Z, more than most previous generations, is coming to Christ, is becoming Christian, and that theology of work needs to permeate their lives, because a lot of people think that Christianity is a cool thing to do on Sundays. Um, but I do think that in this chaotic moment that we're in, there will be a lot of anti-fragility that has that springs out of the struggles that we're going through. How would you recommend to people my age, people my generation, riding the wave of riding the wave of chaos?
Well, I would recommend people ride the wave of chaos by first recognizing that chaos is going to be with us always on this side of glory, that it is part of the fallen world, that we address chaos with prayerful faithfulness, humble trust in a sovereign God, that we seek to be faithful and obedient and diligent. There is a real anti-fragility in obedience. And so obedience to me involves trust. It involves not calling evil good and not calling good evil. And I see too much of that going on these days.
Yeah. What do you see down the road for you guys as you're trying to invest in a Christian way, work in a Christian way?
In terms of how do we go about investing in a Christian way?
That, and also, how do you think that's going to differentiate you from the rest of the competition?
Yeah, I think that we have a real responsibility to understand what our objective is, that we are utilizing capital markets as a means to an end, and that the end itself is individual financial objectives that people have. Those are people that have entrusted us with a fiduciary duty to deliver solutions for them. And that embedded in capital markets is the reality of businesses that produce goods and services for others. And we could use debt or we could use equity, but all we are fundamentally doing is trying to help meet the needs of others, in this case, our clients, by investing in businesses that are trying to meet the needs of others, which in that case is producing goods and services. That lack of self-awareness or self-consciousness about what the economic process is and what financial services ultimately are is incredibly short-sighted. We want to have a very deep level of self-awareness about what it is we're doing, for who and how. Then within the actual process of dividend stock picking, for example, build up a success and an ability and a precision and a skill set that gives us the ability to use our platform for greater good still. The companies that are impeding their own returns, their own success through bad policies, that we can engage with them to get them to be better. And I think that represents a very strong differentiation from a lot of folks out there that may be engaged in the business of giving financial advice, but are not particularly self-aware, self-conscious about it. And then within the process of them doing so, are not seeking to leverage the resources they have for better engagement. And those are all things I take very, very seriously.
Yeah, and investing like a Christian, investing to bless others, is a very Christian idea and a very humbling idea. And so I think it'll be interesting to see in the next decade how much you guys grow as you you know have Main Street's interests at heart. Where can people find more of this? Where can they learn more about your work, what you guys are doing?
Well, dividendcafe.com is the easiest web URL for me to give because it doesn't force me to spell my last name. And so dividendcafe.com is our kind of hub of investment commentary and various resources. From there, people can find the Bahnsen Group's website, a lot of information about our company. There's a podcast, there's a YouTube page, there's all the different mediums of content and idea generation that we represent. But as far as a good single website, I'd direct people to, it'd be Dividend Cafe.
Fantastic. I'll put that link in the description. I'll also put your website so they don't have to spell it.
Thank you. Yes, if the last name had been spelled like Johnson, it would be a lot easier, but all the different vowels really throw people off.
You know, the H really gives people a whirl. I run into the same problem. I can't
Yes,
name any website after me. So
yes,
there you go.
understood.
Appreciate it, David. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
See you guys.